The growl began low in Ghorza Ironhide's throat the moment the First Lord leaned across the treaty table and winked at her. It was not a polite sound. It was not an uncertain sound. It was the sound a wolf makes when something has walked into its territory wearing the skin of a fool, and every man in the great hall of Thornwall Castle heard it and went very still. The lord, a red-faced merchant noble named Aldrich Brent, who had made his fortune taxing river trade and spent it on rings he wore on every finger, pulled his hand back from the table as though the wood had bitten him. The feast chatter died. Candles flickered in the sudden quiet. 20 faces turned toward the green-skinned woman seated at the far end of the high table, and none of them looked comfortable. Ghorza did not look at any of them. She was sitting rigidly upright in a carved chair that had been built for a man half again her width, wearing form-fitting warrior's leathers dyed the deep brown of river mud and stitched with copper rings along the shoulders and the sides of her waist. The bodice laced tight from her sternum to her hip, shaped to the powerful curves of her body, and her arms were left bare, green and muscled, and marked along the left forearm with the clan brand of the Ironhide warband, a looping scar that looked like a river bending. Her black hair was pulled back in a thick rope of braids threaded with small iron beads, and her eyes, which were the color of old amber, moved slowly around the room and found nothing worth softening for. She was the war leader's second. She was the treaty witness. She was 26 years old and had seen 3 full campaigns along the river border before she was 20, and she had not been sent to this feast to be winked at. The growl faded. Lord Brent discovered something very interesting to examine on his own plate. Silence stretched, and that was when Simon Keller walked into the hall. He was not supposed to be at the feast. That much was obvious from the way he came in through the side door near the kitchens, still wearing his bridge-warden's coat, brown wool, road-worn, with a brass tollkeeper's badge on the left breast that had been polished recently enough to catch candlelight. He was carrying a folded leather document pouch that he pressed into the hands of the castle steward with a few quiet words, and then he stepped back and looked around the room as though trying to find a wall to fade into. He was not much to look at, honestly. He was of middling height and middling build, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that could have used a razor 2 days ago. His hands were the hands of a man who worked outdoors in all weather, scarred across the knuckles, calloused at the palm. He had the particular quality of a man who had spent a great deal of time alone, not shy exactly, but undemanding, as though he expected very little from the space he occupied and was entirely prepared to be correct about that. He glanced once around the room the way a man catalogues a landscape for hazards, and his gaze passed across the high table, and then it stopped. Ghorza felt it before she tracked it. She had been watching Lord Brent with the cold patience of a woman deciding how much irritation to allow herself, and then something changed in the quality of the air near the side door, and she turned her head without meaning to, following the instinct, and found a pair of gray eyes looking directly at her. Not at her tusks, not at her arms, not at her clan brand with that mixture of fascination and revulsion she had come to read as easily as a weather sign. He was looking at her face, at her eyes specifically. And his expression was neither frightened nor hungry nor contemptuous. It was just honest. She had not been looked at honestly in so long that it took her a full 3 seconds to identify what she was feeling, and by then Simon Keller had already looked away and begun moving toward the back of the hall, clearly intending to leave. Ghorza watched him go. She was still watching when Lord Brent said something to his companion about the Ironhide clan's marriage customs, and she heard it, and she growled again, deeper this time, less warning, more verdict, and Lord Brent shut his mouth so fast his teeth clicked. The man at the side door paused. He had heard the growl. He looked back across the hall, and this time Ghorza did not look away. She kept her amber eyes on him steady and still, and something happened in his expression that was not quite surprise and not quite recognition, and was entirely something she had no word for. And then a castle guard appeared at his elbow and murmured something, and he was escorted out, and the feast closed back over the space where he had stood like water over a stone. Ghorza turned back to the table. She reached for her wine and drank half of it. Beside her, the Ironhide war leader's envoy, a heavy-set orc named Durek who had the diplomatic instincts of a battering ram, leaned close and whispered, "You frightened Lord Brent again." "Good," Ghorza said. "The treaty." "Will still be a treaty tomorrow. Lord Brent's feelings are not a treaty." Durek made a sound that was not agreement but was not argument either, which was usually the best she could get from him. She set her cup down and did not look at the side door again. She made herself not look. She was here for the treaty. She was here because Chief Morta had sent her specifically, because she was the only Ironhide who could read a contract clause, and also lift a man over her head if the contract clause failed. And neither of those abilities had anything to do with gray-eyed bridge-wardens who looked at her like she was a person. She made it 4 more minutes before she looked at the side door again. He was gone. Of course he was gone. She drank the rest of her wine. The treaty talks had been ongoing for 11 days before the feast, which meant that Simon Keller had been crossing paths with the castle's temporary residents for 11 days without Ghorza knowing he existed, which meant she had spent 11 perfectly functional days in a state of ignorance that, now that it was broken, seemed slightly wasteful. She learned who he was the next morning at the bridge. Thornwall's river crossing was called the Graymere Bridge, and it was the whole reason there was a war to negotiate about. The Graymere ran cold and fast out of the northern highlands and cut a clean border between the Ironhide clan territories and the Thornwall March, and whoever controlled the bridge controlled the trade wool and timber moving south, iron ore and smoked provisions moving north. For 30 years there had been contested crossings, tariff disputes, and every few years a skirmish that killed people on both sides and solved nothing. The current negotiation was an attempt, the third in a generation, to set proper treaty rates and mutual tolls, and stop the killing over a stretch of gray stone and rushing water that neither side could afford to lose and neither could afford to take outright. Simon Keller was the bridge-warden, had been for 4 years by what she gathered. The bridge was his jurisdiction, not the castles, not the clans, but a neutral post maintained by an old charter between the March and the Highlands that predated the current conflict by 60 years. He collected tolls from both sides at the same rate, kept the bridge in repair, and answered to nobody, which was either the most politically elegant solution anyone had ever devised or a complete accident of history that had survived by luck. Possibly both. Ghorza found out all of this by walking to the bridge at dawn, which she did because she had slept badly and needed to move, and found him there checking the iron rings on the western gate for rust, a pot of oil in one hand and a rag in the other, doing the work of a man who regarded his bridge with the particular affection of someone who had nothing else to regard. She stopped at the toll gate. He heard her and looked up from his work. "Toll is 2 copper for an individual crossing," he said, and his voice was exactly as she might have predicted from looking at him, moderate, unhurried, slightly roughened by weather. Then he recognized her and straightened. "Sorry. You're with the envoy party. The treaty covers passage for—" "I know what the treaty covers," she said. "I wrote half of it." He considered that for a moment. "Then you know the morning crossing is free until the 7th bell if you want to walk across." "I want to know who you are," she said, and she had not meant to say it quite so directly, but it came out that way and she left it. He looked at her steadily in the early light, which was pale and blue-gray over the river, and she could see the questions forming and dissolving in his expression. Not the usual questions, not the "what are you doing here and aren't you dangerous" questions, but something more practical. He said, "Simon Keller, bridge-warden, you were at the feast last night. I delivered the transit ledgers for the treaty record. I wasn't invited." "Nobody invites bridge-wardens to feasts," she said. "No, generally not." He did not sound bothered by this. He turned back to the gate ring and applied the oil rag with a methodical twist. "You're Ghorza Ironhide. I know who you are too. The stories about you along the border are considerable. What kind of stories? That you fought 3 Thornwall soldiers at the Keld Ford, crossing 6 years ago when they tried to charge a double toll on Ironhide wool carts, and you won handily. That you negotiated the grain relief during the hunger year and the Western farmers still thank you for it. That you have strong opinions about tariff fairness. He glanced at her sideways. And that you growl at people who annoy you. Ghorza was quiet for a moment. All of that is accurate. Seemed like it might be. He finished the gate ring and moved to the next one. You want to walk the bridge? I won't charge you. She walked the bridge. He walked beside her, not crowding, not performing, just walking in the way a man walks a path he knows well. The Graymere ran loud and white below the stone arches. The morning air smelled of cold water and pine resin from the northern bank. The eastern parapet is lower than it should be, she said, looking down at the water. Someone worked on it recently. 3 years ago, ice damage. The repair held, but I didn't have enough stone to bring the height back up all the way. I've requested materials from both sides. He paused. Neither side has sent any. She looked at him. I'll put it in the treaty record. He stopped walking. He turned to look at her with an expression that was careful and slightly incredulous, as though she had offered him something he was not sure he was allowed to accept. You would do that. The bridge is the whole point of the treaty. If the bridge falls down, everyone's time is wasted. She turned away from the parapet and started back toward the Thornwall side. I'm not doing it for you specifically. Of course not, he said, and she could hear the faint shape of a smile in his voice, and she found she did not dislike it. She did not go back to the bridge the next morning. She stayed in the castle and worked on the treaty language with Durak and the Thornwall clerks and a sweating magistrate named Combe who kept losing his page and finding it again. And she put the parapet materials into the 4th annexure and noted them as infrastructure maintenance required for treaty compliance, which meant both sides were obligated to contribute, which was the only way anything got done along the Graymere. She went back the morning after that. He was there. Of course he was there. He was always there. It was his bridge. He was doing something with a length of rope and the eastern anchor post, a knot she did not recognize, and he untied it and retied it twice while she watched from the toll gate. Wrong knot, she asked. Right knot, wrong tension. The anchor rope needs to account for the water level this time of year or it works itself loose. He got it on the 3rd attempt and tested it with his full weight, which was not a small weight for a man of his build, and it held. He stood up and brushed grit from his knees and said, The 4th annexure went into the magistrate's records yesterday morning. I know, I was there. I found out because Lord Brent came to the bridge personally to complain to me about it. She felt her jaw tighten. What did he say? He said it was an unreasonable demand and that bridge maintenance should be funded by toll revenue, not treaty obligation. Simon picked up the rope's end and coiled it with the neat economy of long practice. I told him the toll revenue has funded 4 years of bridge maintenance alone, without contribution from either side, and that the current rate is the same rate set 60 years ago and hasn't been adjusted for materials cost. He didn't enjoy that. Ghorza looked at him for a long moment. You told Lord Brent he was wrong. I told him the accurate figures. He was free to draw his own conclusions. He has the ear of the Thornwall chief negotiator. I'm aware. Simon set the coiled rope over a hook on the gate post and met her eyes with the particular steadiness of a man who has thought something through and made peace with it. The figures are still accurate. She could not have explained precisely why that particular quality in him, the plain-spoken willingness to say a true thing to a powerful person and absorb whatever came of it, without drama or bravado, as simply the right action struck her as deeply as it did. She had known warriors braver in the physical sense. She had known negotiators cleverer. But this specific combination, quiet spine and no performance of it, was not something she had expected to find in a tollkeeper at a border bridge, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that it was lodging somewhere under her ribs where inconvenient things tended to lodge. Come to the feast tonight, she said. There is another one, final negotiations. He blinked. I'm not invited. I am inviting you. I have guest privilege. You have guest privilege, and you want to use it on a bridge-warden. I want to use it on someone who will not wink at me or make comments about my people's marriage customs, she said, and she did not mean it to sound as raw as it did, and she heard it come out raw, and she did not retract it because it was the truth. Something happened in his expression. Not pity, she would have left immediately for pity. Something quieter. Something that looked more like recognition, like a man who has also spent time in rooms where he was not quite wanted and understood what that particular air tasted like. All right, he said. I'll come. The feast was in the castle's great hall again, which smelled of tallow and wood smoke, and the kind of political tension that made the food taste of nothing. Simon arrived through the main gate this time, still in his bridge-warden's coat because it was the best thing he owned and it was clean, and Ghorza was already at the high table and watched him navigate the room with the particular careful attention she gave to things she had decided were worth watching. He sat at the lower table with the clerks and minor functionaries, which was where a bridge-warden sat at a feast whether he was invited or not. She could see him from the high table. She watched him exchange careful small talk with a Thornwall clerk and eat steadily without apparent enjoyment of the food, which told her the food was not very good, which she had also found. Lord Brent arrived late and sat directly across from Ghorza at the high table, and he had clearly decided to make a second attempt at whatever social gambit the wink had been the opening of, because he leaned forward with an expression of practiced warmth and said something about the exotic beauty of the Ironhide women, and how he understood there were orc customs of a personal nature that were different from human ones, and he had a broad-minded view of. The growl that came out of Ghorza at that moment was loud enough that the lower tables went silent. Lord Brent went the color of old paste. Durak, on her left, gripped his wine cup with white-knuckled resignation. The Thornwall chief negotiator looked like a man watching a bridge burn and calculating the cost. And from the lower table, clearly audible in the sudden hush, Simon Keller said, calmly and without raising his voice, "Lord Brent, the third annexure still has your signature blocking the materials clause. Did you want to discuss that discrepancy now or after the meal?" Every head turned toward him. He was cutting a piece of bread with the concentration of a man who had not just redirected an entire room's attention away from a catastrophic diplomatic moment. Lord Brent sputtered. The Thornwall clerk next to Simon said something about the annexure. Lord Brent said he had no idea what anyone was talking about. The magistrate comb surfaced from somewhere with his pages and began explaining the annexure in a voice that suggested he had been waiting for an opportunity to explain the annexure for several days. The moment passed. The feast noise returned. Ghorza looked at Simon Keller from across the room, and he was looking at his bread, and then he glanced up and found her eyes, and something passed between them that she could not name and did not try to. She just looked at him, steadily, the way she had at the bridge. He looked back. His expression was very still and very warm, and she thought, "Oh, that is what that is." After the feast, she found him in the courtyard collecting his horse from the stable boy. The night air was cold and clear, stars thick over the castle walls, and she came up beside him and said nothing for a moment, and he said nothing, and the horse stamped once and was still. "Thank you," she said finally. "For what?" "You know for what." He turned to look at her. Up close in the torchlight, she could see that his gray eyes had lines at the corners from squinting into the weather, and there was a scar along his jaw that she had not noticed before, thin and old, from something that had happened a long time ago and left its mark quietly. She was taller than him by a hand's width. His horse was taller than both of them. She was aware of the proximity with an intensity that was not entirely comfortable. "You were going to say something back to him," Simon said. "It was not a question. I was going to say several things." "Would it have helped the treaty?" she breathed out. "No." Then I'm glad I had a question about the annexure. She looked at him for a long moment. Did you actually have a question about the annexure? His mouth curved at one corner. I've had that question for 3 days. It just became relevant. She laughed. It came out rougher than she intended, not her polished negotiator's manner but the real one, the laugh she used when she was with the clan and something was genuinely funny, and she watched his expression shift at the sound of it, not startled, but something, and she thought again. "Oh, walk with me," she said. "I don't want to go back inside." They walked the outer wall circuit, which was long and cold and lit by evenly spaced torches, and she told him about the treaty as though he were a useful audience, which he was, because he had been managing the practical consequence of the border dispute for 4 years, and had opinions that were neither political nor emotional, but grounded in the specific reality of water levels and wagon weights and seasonal price fluctuations in iron ore. And she found herself listening as much as she talked. And the hour that passed felt like 20 minutes. At the north corner of the wall, where the torch was guttering and the night was very dark and very cold, she stopped walking. He stopped beside her, close. She could feel the warmth of him in the cold air, which was an absurd thing to notice about a man she had known for 3 days, and she noticed it anyway. "The treaty is going to pass," she said. "Yes, I think so. And then the Ironhide envoy returns home and I go with them." A pause. "Yes, that follows. And you stay here." She was looking out over the wall at the darkness beyond, the river invisible below but audible, always audible, that cold, continuous sound. "At your bridge. It's where I belong," he said simply, with no self-pity in it. "Yes." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the darkness too, and the torchlight from behind them lit the side of his face, the jaw, the scar, the corner of his eye. She said very quietly, without planning it, "I have been alone for a long time." He turned his head. His eyes found hers in the dark and stayed there. "Soldiers and warriors," she said, "have a particular loneliness. You are always surrounded and you are never with anyone." "Yes," he said. Not "I know" or "I understand," just yes, the direct acknowledgement of a man who also knew. "I have not told anyone that in a very long time," she said. "I know what it is to talk to a river," he said. "It sounds foolish out loud, but I know what it is. The bridge is mine and I am proud of it. And sometimes I go days without speaking to another person and the silence has weight." She was looking at him in the dark and his face was very close, and she thought, "I could close this distance." The thought was clear and calm and certain in the way that decisions are when you have stopped pretending you haven't made them. She reached out and touched his jaw, her thumb against the scar. He went very still, not afraid, but the way something attentive holds still, a man registering something important with his full attention. Her hand was warm and his face was cold from the night air, and she felt him breathe slowly out against her palm. "I don't know what this is," she said. "I know what I want it to be." "What do you want it to be?" he said low, just the two of them in the dark. "Something real," she said. "Something that matters after the treaty is signed." He turned his face into her palm just slightly, the smallest movement, a man leaning toward warmth. He said, "Then let it be that." She kissed him. She closed the distance and she kissed him, and it was not tentative. She was not a tentative woman. His hands came up to her arms and held on, not pulling her close, just holding on the way you hold something you haven't been sure you were allowed to want. And she kissed him thoroughly in the cold dark at the top of the castle wall, with the river running invisible below them, and thought, "Yes, this is something real." When she stepped back, his expression was entirely open. No performance, no composure, just a man looking at her like she had given him something he had stopped believing he would receive. "The treaty passes in 3 days," he said. "Yes. And you return with the envoy." "Yes." She held his gaze. "Unless I find a reason to stay." He was quiet for a moment. "Then I have a request for bridge maintenance materials that requires a treaty witness to certify. It could take time to process properly." She looked at him. "How much time?" "Months if it needs to be done correctly." She breathed in the cold air. She breathed out. She said, "Then we had better do it correctly." The treaty was signed on the 14th morning. in the great hall with all the appropriate ceremony, and all the appropriate people seated at all the appropriate tables. And Ghorza signed her name in the Ironhide witness column in the broad firm strokes of a woman who has always held a pen like a weapon, not delicately, but with intent. She watched the seals pressed and the ribbons tied and Durak's expression of tremendous relief at having survived 11 days without causing a diplomatic incident, and she thought, "Good, this is done. Now the other thing begins." She told Durak she was staying to certify the materials clause implementation. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who knew her well enough to know there was more to it and enough discretion not to say so, and he said, "Chief Morta will want a report within the month. Chief Morta will have one. And you'll be safe here." "Durak," she said, with gentle patience, "I have been safe in harder places than this." He grunted. He left with the rest of the envoy. She watched them ride north across the bridge, over the gray stone, over the cold river, and then she turned around and went to find the bridge-warden. The weeks that followed were the strangest she had known. She took a room at the Red Crow Inn, which was the only inn in Thornwall that would accommodate an orc guest without drama. The innkeeper was a former soldier who had served in the Highlands and knew what Ironhide meant, and had the simple practical sense to want her money. She worked. She processed the materials clause certification, which was genuinely complicated and not simply an excuse, involving measurements and material specifications, and a correspondence with a quarry in the Western Highlands that took 2 weeks to resolve. She went to the bridge every morning. Simon was always there. They developed a rhythm that felt, in retrospect, inevitable. She at one end of the bridge with her ledgers and correspondence, him at the other with his tools and his toll gate, occasionally converging in the middle to look at the parapet or talk about the water level, or eat the lunch she had taken to bringing from the inn, because the bridge had no shelter, and the autumn was getting colder, and he ate bread and dried meat every day as though it had simply not occurred to him that food could be warmer than that. "You don't eat well," she told him on the 4th day, handing him a wrapped piece of roasted pork and a small container of the hearty grain soup the Red Crow served for midday. "I eat enough," he said. "That is the exact thing a man says when he is not eating well." She sat on the parapet on the repaired section, which was solid if still not quite the right height, and opened her own lunch. "Eat the soup first. It's cold out." He sat beside her and ate the soup. She could feel the warmth of his shoulder against hers through both their layers of clothing, and she did not move away. He did not either. They ate in comfortable silence and watched 2 ox carts from the northern bank pay their toll and rumble south, and she stamped the crossing in the ledger, and he collected the copper, and the day went on. She found herself thinking about what she had said on the wall. Something real. She had meant it as a hope, the night she said it, and now, 3 weeks into the reality of shared lunches and parapet repairs and evenings that stretched long over the hearth at the Red Crow while she wrote her reports, and he read the border survey maps and occasionally said things that were useful, she understood that it was not a hope anymore. She understood it specifically one evening in late autumn when a group of Thornwall men came into the Red Crow, and one of them recognized her, and said something loud and ugly about orc women sitting in human spaces as though they owned them. And Simon set down his map without any particular change of expression, and said, in that moderate and entirely non-negotiable voice, "She is here at my invitation, and she is a treaty-certified official of the Graymere Border Commission. And you would owe both her and this table an apology if you'd like to continue drinking in this inn." The man puffed up. His friends looked less certain. The innkeeper appeared from behind the bar with an expression of readiness that suggested he had already made the same calculation Simon had. The man said something about knowing his rights. Simon said he was glad to discuss rights in the morning at the toll gate, which was the formal venue for official grievances, but that this was the evening and he was sitting with someone and would appreciate not being disturbed. The men left. Not quietly, not gracefully, but they left. Ghorza looked at Simon. He had picked up his map again, He met her eyes over the top of it and said, "Where were you in the survey?" "Western Bank Road." "Western Bank Road," she said. She reached across the table under the map and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they looked at the map together, and she thought, this is what it is to not be alone, this specific thing, a hand in the dark and someone who stays. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. Neither of them said anything about it. They didn't need to. The materials arrived from the quarry in the second week of the following month. A convoy of 3 heavy carts coming down from the highlands with the gray stone that matched the bridge's original construction. Simon had arranged the labor himself, 2 masons from Thornwall town and a young orc laborer named Brick who was Durak's nephew and had stayed after the treaty party because he wanted to learn masonry, and the masons he'd asked in the Highland camps had sent him south with a letter of introduction that Simon had honored without hesitation. The parapet repair took 6 days. Ghorza was on the bridge for all of it. She helped lift stone when the load was heavy, which it frequently was, and she did it without being asked, because she was there and capable and the work needed doing. And she watched Simon work beside Brick and the 2 masons with a steady practical cheerfulness, answering questions and fetching tools, and treating the young orc exactly as he treated anyone who was doing good work, which was to say with straightforward respect and the occasional dry observation. On the 5th day of the repair, as they were setting the final course of stones, Lord Brent arrived at the bridge. He came on horseback with 2 attendants, and an expression that suggested he had been waiting for an opportunity, and had identified this as one. He stopped his horse at the toll gate and addressed himself to Simon in a carrying voice, and said that, in his understanding, the materials provided for this repair had been charged to the Treaty Common Fund at a rate he considered excessive, and that a bridge-warden's authority to commit treaty funds without Marchland approval was legally questionable, and that he intended to bring a formal complaint. Simon set down the level he was holding. He walked to the toll gate. He said the rate was certified by the treaty witness. The authorization was signed by your own chief negotiator. The legal question you're describing was resolved in the 3rd annexure. I can show you the document. I don't need to see. I have it here, Simon said, and produced the document from the gate post sealed document box, the one he kept there for exactly these situations, and he walked to Lord Brent's horse and held it up with the calm certainty of a man who keeps his records correctly, because he has always known that some days you need to hand them to someone on horseback who is trying to tell you that the sky is green. Lord Brent stared at the document. His attendants looked at the river. Ghorza came to stand beside Simon. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She stood at his shoulder, 7 feet of scarred green muscle and copper-ringed leather, and looked at Lord Brent with the amber eyes of a woman who has signed every page in that document and knows every clause in it by heart, and is experiencing a very specific quality of calm. Lord Brent took the document. He examined it for a period that was longer than examination required and shorter than retreat, and then he handed it back and said he would review the matter with the magistrate, and turned his horse and rode back toward the castle. Simon took the document back and returned it to the document box, and then he looked at her and she looked at him, and she said, "You have a very patient way of being correct. I've had practice." She was looking at his profile, the jaw, the scar, and she said without meaning to let it out so early in the morning with masonry dust on her hands, "I think I am falling in love with you." He went very still. The Graymere ran loud beneath them. Brick and the masons were at the far end of the parapet and not listening. The morning was gray and cold and smelled of stone dust and cold water. Simon turned to look at her. "I think," he said very carefully, "that the feeling is exactly mutual." She had not known, she thought, that those words could feel like being given something back that she had stopped expecting. She had not known that hearing someone say a plain, true thing could expand inside her ribcage like the first breath after cold water. She took his face in both her hands and kissed him there on the bridge in the gray morning with the stone dust and the cold river and brick very carefully looking at the parapet. And she kissed him the way she had on the castle wall, but this time without the question in it, this time with the answer. When she let him go, his expression was the same entirely open one, no performance, all warmth, and he said, "The parapet still needs the top course set." "I know," she said. "We should probably do that." "Yes." She did not move. His mouth curved. He reached up and took one of her hands from his face and held it briefly and then let it go and went back to the parapet, and she watched him pick up the level and go to work, and she thought, yes, this is what I came for, not the treaty. Not the materials clause. This man and his bridge and his steady hands and the way he says plain, true things in the cold morning and means all of them. She went back to work. The top course was set by midday. The parapet was done. It was 3 days after the parapet was finished that Lord Brent made his move, and it came from a direction that none of them had anticipated. The formal complaint he had taken to the magistrate was not about the materials rate. It was about Ghorza's status. Specifically, his argument was that a treaty witness who had remained in Thornwall territory after the treaty signing was operating without current authorization, and that her continued involvement in bridge affairs, including her cossening of the materials certification, was legally null, and that all decisions made under that certification were subject to review, and that the bridge-warden could be held liable for any actions taken under the invalid authorization. Ghorza read the complaint in the magistrate's office and felt the cold, specific anger that comes with recognizing a knife aimed not at you, but at someone near you through you. He was not going after the bridge. He was going after Simon through the bridge. And the argument was not entirely without legal traction, because the original treaty had not specified what a treaty witness's standing was after the document was signed, because no one had anticipated that a treaty witness would stay. She needed a legal answer, and she needed it in 2 days, because the magistrate was convening a hearing in 2 days, and if she didn't have a rebuttal on the record, Lord Brent's complaint would default to provisional acceptance. She sat with Simon that night at the Red Crow, with the treaty documents spread across every surface and a lantern burning low, and wrote the argument together. He was not a lawyer, but he knew the border charter and he knew the transit regulations, and he had 4 years of toll records that established the bridge's jurisdictional independence, and she was the treaty witness, and she knew the document's language the way she knew the back of her own hand. At some point deep in the night, past the 2nd hour, she looked up from the clause she was parsing and found him asleep at the table, his head resting on his folded arms, the survey map still open under his cheek. He had been awake since before dawn. He had worked the bridge all day and then worked this all evening, and he had simply run out. She sat for a moment and looked at him. The lantern light was warm and low, and he looked in sleep like a man who had put down a weight he had been carrying, the careful watchfulness gone, just quiet. She thought of what he had said about talking to a river, about silence with weight. She reached out and very gently moved the survey map so it wasn't creasing against his face. She pulled her own traveling cloak from the chair back and draped it over his shoulders. Then she picked up the treaty document and kept working. She had the rebuttal drafted before dawn. It was watertight, she was sure of it. It cited the charter precedent, the annexure language, the transit regulations, and a specific clause in the treaty's preamble that she had written herself 11 days ago specifically, because she had seen Lord Brent's signature on the first draft and recognized the shape of a man who would need to be anticipated. She had put it there on purpose. She had not known then that she would be the one it protected. But she had always written for the possibility of being wrong about people's intentions, and that habit had served her now. When Simon woke at dawn, he found the cloak and the finished document and her at the inn's front window watching the river road with a mug of tea going cold in her hand. He read the document. He set it down. He came and stood beside her at the window. "This is brilliant," he said. "It is accurate," she said, "which is the same thing. You stayed up all night. You needed sleep." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Ghorza, don't," she said, not unkindly. "I didn't do it for gratitude. I did it because you were right and he was wrong, and I am very tired of correct people losing to incorrect ones, because they didn't have the right clause written down at the right moment." She glanced at him sideways. "And because it was your bridge." "And because it was my bridge," he agreed softly. "Drink something," she said. "The hearing is in 2 hours." The hearing was held in the castle's court chamber, which had a low ceiling and a smell of cold stone and old candle smoke, and Magistrate Combe presided with the air of a man who had hoped his calendar would be simpler than this and had stopped expecting it to be. Lord Brent was there with his own clerk and a hired advocate who had a good coat and an overconfident manner. Simon stood on one side of the room. Ghorza stood beside him. She made the argument herself. She spoke for 12 minutes in the flat, precise language of a woman who has learned that emotion in a legal chamber gives the other side something to dismiss. And she laid out every clause and every citation, and the specific precedent from the 30-year-old charter that made the bridge's jurisdictional independence not a matter of interpretation but of record. And she put the document on the magistrate's table and let it be read. The advocate started to speak. Ghorza waited. He made 3 arguments. She answered each one from memory without consulting her notes, because she had not written those notes for memory. She had written them so that Combe could follow, and she had memorized the underlying documents because that was what she did, because she was Ghorza Ironhide and she had not survived 15 years on the border by leaving anything important only half known. Combe deliberated for all of 10 minutes and found in favor of the Bridge Commission. Lord Brent's complaint was dismissed. The material certification stood. The bridge-warden's actions were confirmed as lawful. Lord Brent left without speaking. His advocate followed. Combe looked across the table at Ghorza and said, with the particular dryness of a man who has watched a lot of hearings, "Well argued. Thank you, magistrate." Outside the court chamber, in the cold courtyard with the sky gray and the castle walls close around them, Simon stopped walking and turned to face her, and she turned to face him, and they stood in the cold and looked at each other. "It's over," he said. "Yes." "What do you want to do now?" She looked at him. She looked at the sky. She looked at the castle gate that opened onto the road to the bridge. She said, "I want to go back to the bridge." He smiled. "Then let's go back to the bridge." They walked through the castle gate and down the road, and the winter air was cold on her face, and she could hear the Graymere before she could see it, that constant cold singing, and she thought, "I know why he loves this place. I understand it now. The permanence of it. The river goes on regardless, the bridge stands or falls and is repaired and stands again, and the man at the gate is still there doing the same honest work, and none of it requires the approval of Lord Brent or anyone like him." She said while they were walking, "I need to send a report to Chief Morda." "Yes. He is going to ask when I am coming home." Simon walked beside her in the cold. He did not look at her. At the road, he said carefully, "What will you tell him?" She let the question sit in the cold air between them for a moment. She said, "I will tell him that the treaty implementation requires continued supervision, that the Bridge Commission is a joint jurisdiction that benefits from Ironhide oversight, that I am doing important work here." She paused, "All of which is true." "It is," he agreed. "And I will tell him," she said, "that I have a reason to stay, a real one." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. They were on the road between the castle and the bridge, halfway, the castle behind and the river ahead, and the bare winter trees on both banks were gray against a gray sky, and the whole world was the particular beautiful bleakness of a cold morning. And he turned to look at her with that expression, the open one, the warm one, the one with no performance in it, and she thought, "There. That is the reason, that exact expression, that man." "I want you to stay," he said, simply, plainly. The way he always said the true things. "Then I'll stay," she said. It was not, it turned out, a simple thing to arrange. Chief Morda was not unreasonable, but he was also not in the habit of having his second-in-command relocate to a human border town without a formal justification, and the formal justification Ghorza provided him. The Bridge Commission oversight, the treaty implementation monitoring, The value of an Ironhide presence in the Marchland negotiations was entirely legitimate, and he knew it and she knew he knew it. And he also knew her well enough to read between the lines, and what he wrote back was, "If you are happy, Ghorza, then this is good. Send your reports on time. Do not let the humans undercharge on the autumn toll." She wrote back, "I am happy, I will. They are not undercharging." I checked. He sent a small personal guard, 2 Ironhide warriors named Yeva and Growled, who were assigned to the Treaty Commission officially and to keeping an eye on Ghorza unofficially, and who took lodgings at the Red Crow and spent a great deal of time looking at Simon with the evaluating expression of people who had opinions about their war leader's second life choices and were not sure whether to voice them. Yeva voiced hers. On the second evening, when Ghorza came back to the inn with cold hands and warm eyes from an afternoon on the bridge, Yeva was sitting at the hearthside and said, without preamble, "He is a human." "Yes," Ghorza said, "I noticed. He is smaller than you." "Somewhat. He runs a toll bridge. He runs it very well." Yeva looked at her for a long moment with the complicated expression of a woman who has known Ghorza for 12 years and watched her be alone and fierce and relentlessly competent, and also aware, under all of it, of a particular kind of hunger that fiercer things did not fill. Then she said, "Does he make you happy?" Ghorza sat down across from her. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew to think about anything. She said, "Yes, he makes me very happy. Specifically and practically, and in a way that I did not believe was available to me." She looked at Yeva steadily. "Does that concern you?" "No," Yeva said, with the finality of a woman closing a question. "It does not concern me." And then quieter, "Good." Growled, for his part, said nothing. But he began helping with the bridge labor when there was labor to be done, and he treated Simon with the careful respect of an Ironhide warrior assessing someone who had earned something, and that was enough. It was deep winter when Lord Brent attempted his final move. He came with riders, 7 of them, which was more than he needed for a social call and fewer than he needed for an armed confrontation, which meant he had probably convinced himself it was the former while planning for the latter. He came to the bridge in the early morning when the frost was still on the stone, and the river was half ice at the edges, and he told Simon, in a voice that carried across the bridge to where Ghorza was checking the eastern toll ledger, that the March Council had decided to reassign the bridge-warden position to a council-appointed official. Simon said, in his moderate and entirely non-negotiable voice, "The bridge-warden position is established by the Border Charter, not the March Council. The Council doesn't have appointment authority. The Council," Lord Brent said, "has decided that the Charter requires reinterpretation in light of current." "Lord Brent," Ghorza said. She had crossed the bridge. She was standing 6 feet behind Simon, and she had the transit ledger under her arm, and she was looking at Lord Brent with the amber eyes and the particular stillness that the Ironhide used before they made a decision that was going to cost someone something. Lord Brent looked at her. "The Ironhide Treaty," she said, "specifically guarantees the bridge-warden's neutrality and the independence of the toll post as a condition of the trade agreement. Any unilateral interference with the warden's position constitutes a treaty violation. A treaty violation triggers the dispute clause. The dispute clause requires both parties to stand down and refer to the Highland Commission." She paused. "The Highland Commission is chaired by Chief Morda. I would be happy to arrange that meeting if you prefer." Lord Brent's face went through several colors. His 7 riders were very still. "The bridge," Ghorza said, "is not a March Council asset. It is a treaty asset. If you attempt to remove this warden from his post, you will not be dealing with him. You will be dealing with me and with the Ironhide Clan Commission and with every clause in that treaty, which I wrote and which I know better than anyone alive. Is that a meeting you want to have this morning, my lord?" Silence. The river ran cold under the bridge. The frost on the stone glittered. One of Lord Brent's horses shifted and blew a cloud of breath into the cold air. Lord Brent turned his horse. He said nothing. He rode back toward the castle with his 7 riders behind him and did not look back, and Ghorza watched them go with the steady attention of a woman who will keep watching until the thing she is watching is no longer a threat. Simon stood beside her. When the riders were out of sight, he said, "He won't try again." "No, he has run out of moves." She lowered the ledger. "He will complain to the March Council, and the March Council will tell him the treaty is not worth reopening over a toll bridge, and he will have to find something else to be angry about." That was, he stopped, started again. "You were, do not say magnificent," she said. "I was going to say thorough." She looked at him sideways. His mouth was doing the thing at the corner. She said, "That was also thorough." "Thorough," he agreed, and she could hear the warmth of it, the honest full warmth. And she put the ledger down on the gate post and turned and took his face in her hands the way she had that first night on the wall. And she kissed him in the frost and the cold morning with the river running beneath them, and Yeva watching from the eastern bank with an expression of absolute unsurprise. The weeks turned. Winter deepened and then began, gradually, to lose its grip, the way winter always does along a river, the ice at the edges going first, then the water rising with snowmelt from the highlands, then the first gray mornings giving way to something with actual color in them. Ghorza moved from the Red Crow to the bridge-warden's house, which was not large, 2 rooms and a loft and a hearth that worked, but which had an eastern window that caught the morning light off the river, and which was, she discovered, the place she had been thinking of as home for longer than she had admitted. Simon did not ask her to move. She told him she intended to, and he said, "All right," and helped carry her things, and that was that. Simple, practical. No ceremony about it, which was, she had come to understand, the shape of how he did everything he cared about straightforwardly, without fuss. In the same way he maintained the bridge and told Lord Brent accurate things and looked at her like she was worth looking at. Yeva and Trolt stayed at the Red Crow. They were close enough to respond to anything that needed responding to, and far enough away to give Ghorza and Simon a life that was their own, and that balance had been established without any of the 4 of them discussing it, which was the best possible way for a balance to be established. The evenings in the bridge-warden's house were, Ghorza thought, the best part. She would not have predicted this. She had spent enough evenings alone with her own thoughts to have made a kind of peace with them, and she had assumed the peace was the best option available. She had not understood that there was another option, which was the evenings in the small house with the fire and the eastern window, and Simon across the table, writing his toll records in his neat practical hand, while she drafted correspondence for Chief Morta, and the particular domestic quiet of 2 people who are comfortable together. He read to her sometimes, from the border survey histories he kept on the shelf above the toll ledgers, dry official things about water levels and road conditions and tariff records going back 100 years, and she listened the way she listened to treaty language for the thing underneath the words, the shape of the actual history. He was a good reader. He had a voice that made dry material interesting, which was, she told him, a wasted talent in a toll warden. "Where would it be less wasted?" he asked. "Somewhere with more people," she said. "You could be a magistrate." "I don't want to be a magistrate, I want to be here." "Here," she said, "with the bridge." "With the bridge," he agreed. And then quieter, "With you." She set down her pen. She looked at him across the table. The fire was low and the room was warm and the river was outside the eastern window and the night was very still. She got up from her chair and went around the table, and he turned to face her, and she sat on the edge of the table and took his hands in both of hers, which were large and green and scarred, and his were scarred differently, work scars, weather scars, the handwriting callous on his 3rd finger, and she held them and said, "Do you know what an Ironhide claiming is?" He met her eyes. "I've heard of it. It is not complicated. It is not a ceremony. It is one person saying to another person, 'You are mine and I am yours, and I will not go from this, and neither will you.'" She held his hands. "It is a choice, made once with full knowledge." He was looking at her with the entirety of his attention. "I am choosing you," she said. "Simon Keller, bridge warden, Man who tells accurate things to people who don't want to hear them. Man who stayed up writing treaty arguments. Man who looked at me across a feast hall like I was a person. Her voice was low and very steady. I am choosing you, not the treaty, not the bridge, you. He was quiet for a moment that was full rather than empty. Then he said, Ghorza. Yes. I have been alone for a long time, he said, which was the same thing she had told him on the castle wall, and he meant it the same way she had, not as complaint but as context, as the shape of the space she was filling. I know, she said. I don't know how to, I don't have a claiming, I don't have say the true thing, she said. That is what you always do, say it. He looked at her. He said, you are mine and I am yours, and I will not go from this, a breath, and neither will you. She lifted his hands and held them against her sternum, against the laced leather of her bodice, against the place where the warmth was. She said, neither will I. She pulled him close and kissed him, and it was different from the bridge and different from the castle wall. Not a beginning and not an answer, but something past both of those. A belonging, a full warmth, a home that was not a place but a person. And she understood for the first time why her mother had said once that the Ironhide claiming was not about what was spoken, but about what was given. And what was given was not something you had set aside and could withdraw. It was something that changed the shape of you permanently, and you had to be sure of that before you gave it. She was sure. The night was long and warm, and theirs. Spring came hard along the Graymere, the way it does in river country, fast thaw and high water, and the bridge worked over by the current until the eastern arch groaned under the load. And Simon was out in boots and rope every morning for 2 weeks, checking the mortar and reinforcing the anchor posts, and watching the water level with the intensity of a man who had one thing he would not let the river take. Ghorza worked beside him. She was stronger than he was, and she knew river current the way all Highland orcs knew it, from childhood learning, and she braced the anchor posts while he mortared, and she called the water level by eye with an accuracy that saved them from having to anchor at the wrong depth twice in the first week. Yeva and Trolt helped when the work was heaviest. Brick came down from wherever he'd taken his masonry apprenticeship and spent a week with them shoring the eastern arch until the water crested and began its slow retreat. There were 5 of them on the bridge in the worst of it, orcs and a human and the river trying its best to undo what they'd built, and none of it succeeded. When the water finally leveled and the bridge stood intact and the morning was clean and cool with the particular smell of a river after a flood, Simon sat on the parapet, the repaired one, solid now, the right height, the gray stones exactly matched, and Ghorza sat beside him, and they both looked at the water going south, wide and brown and spent. She tried, she said. She always tries, he said, and we always repair. She looked at the bridge below them, the arches, the stone, the anchor ropes taut and right. She thought of the first time she had crossed it, 4 months ago in the blue-gray dawn, looking for a toll she didn't owe and finding something she hadn't known she was looking for. She thought of him with his oil rag and his gate ring and the sideways look that wasn't afraid. Next flood, she said, I want to reinforce the western anchor before the thaw. I've been thinking the same thing, he said. If we pour a stone collar around the post base before winter, yes. And the eastern arch needs a second survey when the water drops further. I'll add it to the record. They sat on the bridge in the spring morning and planned the next season's repairs and the season after that, and Ghorza thought, yes, this is what it looks like, the life I didn't know I was building, not a campaign or a negotiation or a ceremony. Stone collars on anchor posts and a man who says yes before she has finished the sentence because he was already thinking the same thing. Summer arrived with trade. The bridge had its busiest season in 4 years. The treaty having opened flow both ways with lower tariff friction and better trust than had existed in a generation. And the toll ledger was thick with entries, and the Graymere crossing was busy from dawn to midday most days. Carts and riders, and on one memorable Thursday, a small herd of Highland cattle that had Ghorza spending 20 minutes in the middle of the road, persuading them one by one past the toll gate, while Simon recorded each animal's crossing fee with extraordinary calm. The treaty anniversary feast was announced in midsummer. The same great hall, the same castle, a formal celebration of the year's peace, the chief negotiator, the Highland Commission, the treaty witnesses all invited. Ghorza read the invitation and thought of the last feast and the growl and the wink and the man she hadn't known yet standing at the side door with a document pouch and gray eyes. She told Simon about it at breakfast. "You have to go," he said. "You're the treaty witness." "I know," she looked at him. "You are coming with me. I'm a bridge-warden." "You are the bridge-warden, the one the treaty was built around. You are invited." She slid the second invitation across the table. She had already arranged it. "As a treaty stakeholder." Official capacity. He looked at the invitation. He looked at her. He said, "You arranged this. Yesterday, while you were re-anchoring the Western Post, she picked up her tea. You will need a clean coat." He looked at his coat. He said, "This is a clean coat. Simon, it is clean. It has river mud on the left cuff." He looked at his cuff. He said, "That is a fair point." The feast was nothing like the first one. Or rather, it was exactly like the first one in all its outward forms. The same hall, the same tallow-smelling torches, the same high table and the same lower tables and magistrate comb looking rumpled and relieved, and Lord Brent seated far enough from the high table that his winks, if he attempted any, would be ineffective. But it was entirely unlike the first one in every quality that mattered. Ghorza sat at the high table as the treaty witness of record. She sat straight and proud, and she wore her warrior's leathers and her iron bead braids, and she looked at the room the way she always did, straight, level, honest, but the growl was entirely absent, because there was no occasion for it. Lord Brent did not look at her. The other lords watched her with the particular careful respect of men who have read a legal argument that could ruin them, and have decided that deference is the correct response. The Highland Commissioner's representative, a Highland orc woman named Sessa, who Ghorza had known since the treaty drafting, sat beside her, and they talked about the summer's trade numbers and the autumn schedule with the easy fluency of two professionals who were very good at the same thing. Simon was at the treaty stakeholders' table, which was not the high table but was not the lower clerk's table either. It was the middle, the witnesses and the officials, the people who had made the thing work rather than merely signed their names to it. Ghorza could see him from the high table. He was wearing a clean coat, a different clean coat, not the river mud one, something he had apparently owned and kept for occasions and almost never had occasion to use. He looked like himself in it, unhurried, undemanding, eating the food with more apparent enjoyment than last year, which she decided was because this year the food was better, and also possibly because this year he was somewhere he belonged. She watched him. He ate and talked to the mason who had worked on the parapet repair, who was also at the stakeholders' table, and he talked to Brick, who had somehow gotten himself invited and was eating with the concentration of a young man experiencing a genuine feast for the first time. He did not look for her. He knew where she was. He did not need to look. She looked at him anyway. She looked at him the way she had across the hall a year ago, when she hadn't known his name, and she felt the same thing she had then, the pull of it, the honesty of it, the specific warmth of someone who had looked at her first. And it was entirely different now because now she knew him, all the way down to the river mud on his coat cuffs, and the way he slept with one arm tucked under his head, and the sound of his voice when he was calculating water pressure. And knowing all of that only made it stronger. Made it bedrock. The speeches were made. The trade figures were cited. The Thornwall chief negotiator said things about lasting peace and mutual benefit that were mostly accurate. Sessa responded for the Highland Commission with the particular diplomatic precision of an Ironhide woman who has read every word of every document and is not going to pretend otherwise. Ghorza added the treaty witness's formal attestation, which she had drafted that morning and had memorized and delivered without notes, because that was how she did it. And then it was done, the formalities were over and the feast itself was underway. And across the room Simon looked up and found her eyes with the ease of a man who always knows where she is, and his expression was the warm, open one, and she thought, yes, a year. This is what a year looks like. This is what the something real looks like when it is a time to become entirely real. She lifted her wine cup. He lifted his. Across the hall, over the heads of the merchants and the clerks and the lords and the masons and Brick, who was eating enormously, they drank to each other, and she thought. I walked into that hall angry and alone and looking for something to growl at, and instead I found a man at a side door with an honest face, and it was the luckiest thing I ever did, not on purpose. After the feast, they walked the outer wall circuit again. The same north corner, the same guttering torch, the same cold and dark, and the river below. She stopped in the same place. He stopped beside her. A year ago, he said. A year ago, she agreed. You were delivering ledgers. You were growling at Lord Brent. He deserved it, entirely. His voice was warm. You looked at me. You looked at me first. Did I? He was quiet for a moment. I suppose I did. I didn't think you noticed. I notice everything, she said. I noticed you were not afraid. I was slightly afraid, he admitted. You're quite a lot of person to walk into a room. She looked at him in the dark. Were you afraid of me specifically? He thought about it honestly, which was how he always thought about things. No. I was afraid that you were someone I was going to think about for a very long time, and that I was probably not the kind of man someone like you thinks about in return. You were wrong about that. Yes, he said, I was. She put her arm around him, not dramatically, not with great significance, just settled her arm around his shoulders the way she did on evenings when the air was cold, and they were standing somewhere outside, and she was taller and warmer, and it was simply the natural arrangement of two people who had decided they were each other's. He leaned into her a little. He always did. The first time he had done it, she had understood that he had always wanted to and had simply been waiting to know it was allowed, and she had tightened her arm and said nothing because nothing was required. The bridge needs the western anchor collar before winter, she said. I was thinking we do it in the early weeks of autumn while the water is still low. I've already priced the stone, he said. Of course you have. I've also been thinking about the northern approach road. The ruts have gotten deep enough to slow the carts. We can request fill gravel from the March Council on treaty authority. I was thinking the same thing. I'll write the request next week. She looked at the dark river below, the invisible rushing water, and thought, yes, this is the shape of a life. Not grand or ceremonial, but solid, planned. Two people and a bridge and a winter to prepare for, and all the seasons after that, and everything solid between them and the cold. Are you happy? She asked him, the same question Yeva had asked her, the only question that mattered. He turned to look at her. In the torchlight, his gray eyes were very still and very warm and entirely certain, and he said, yes, Ghorza, I am very happy. He said it simply, like all the true things, like water levels and treaty clauses, without decoration or exaggeration, just the accurate thing stated as itself. She held it. She let it settle in the place under her ribs where inconvenient things had taken up permanent residence and turned into something that was not inconvenient at all. Good, she said. Then so am I. She pulled him closer in the cold, and he put his arm around her waist, and they stood at the north corner of the castle wall with the river running below them and the torch guttering in the night wind. And she was Ghorza Ironhide, war second and treaty witness, woman who growled at lords and wrote legal arguments by lantern light and chose, once, deliberately, with full knowledge, the man at the side door, and she was happy, specifically and practically and in a way that was entirely available to her. Had been, it turned out, waiting for her at a gray stone bridge over a cold, fast river. All she'd had to do was look.